For more on the president's NATO meeting, Dan Kochis is a foreign policy analyst focusing on European affairs at the Heritage Foundation, and he joins me from Washington. Dan, what do you make of the president's continued effort to press for countries to pay their fair share?
Well, I think that this is a continuation of something that American presidents, both Republicans and Democrats, have complained about, frankly, for quite a long time. In 2015, if every NATO member had reached that 2% threshold that was established over a decade ago, we would have over $100 billion more in defense spending. So we have seen some recent increases, but clearly there's a huge gap, I think, in NATO capabilities. And the president is continued, I think, to hammer that message home, and rightfully so.
The other thing that the president has been so focused on is NATO's future, focusing on counterterrorism, combating terrorism. Right. Are all the NATO countries on board with that, or is there any opposition?
Well, I think that there's varying views as far as what NATO's role, I think, in the counterterrorism realm is. NATO is an intergovernmental alliance, and it doesn't necessarily have the legislative tools to do things like block funding to terrorists. It also doesn't have policy purview over things like border control and policing. So it really isn't the right vehicle, I think, for counterterrorism. Now, that isn't to say that, of course, NATO doesn't have a role. NATO is in Iraq training security forces there. There's over 13,000 NATO forces in Afghanistan. Quite a few NATO countries, of course, are either providing surveillance aircraft, trainers on the ground, or actually dropping bombs against ISIL in the Middle East. But that said, I think you set the alliance up for failure if you focus too heavily on the counterterrorism aspect. NATO needs to be getting back to basics, and that basic is territorial defense of the member states.
And all of these member states have individually already pledged their loyalty in fighting terrorism as well.
That's absolutely right. Of course, every member state of NATO has an interest in fighting against terrorism, and they've taken part in some of these missions countering ISIL. But NATO isn't the right vehicle as an intergovernmental alliance to tackle terrorism. And so you're seeing a few things that NATO is doing, setting up a coordinator, a new unit to track foreign fighters, increased surveillance over Turkey for the AWACS aircrafts. But I still think that the main focus of the alliance is going to be on countering Russia and territorial defense. But there have been some incremental steps to boost what the alliance can do to fight terrorism. But I do think that what they can do as an alliance is limited.
Now, President Trump didn't mention Article 5. Are you surprised that it states an attack on any member is an attack on all? Are you surprised about that?
I would have liked to have heard it again, but, I wasn't necessarily surprised because he stated it when he spoke to Congress in the late winter. The defense secretary, the vice president have also reiterated this. I believe the president also told both Prime Ministers May and Chancellor Merkel in their meetings at the White House that the United States was committed to Article 5. And I think you've seen, on the ground, the U.S. Troops going into Poland have continued unabated. U.S. F-35 aircraft are in places like Amari Air Base in Estonia. They are also down south in Romania. So, I think that U.S. commitment has continued. And so I think that whether or not the president has specifically reiterated that again in Brussels, the U.S. is committed and will remain so to Article 5 of the NATO founding treaty.
You mentioned the U.S. commitment. Let's look ahead to the G7 summit. A big question is whether President Trump will pull out of the Paris Agreement on climate change. What are you hearing?
Well, I think that that's something that we've heard some different things coming out of the administration. I think that there are some within the administration that would like to see the United States climb out of this climate agreement. I think that there are others that would like to see the United States stay in. I don't really know where the president is going to come down on this, and so it'll be very interesting to see at the G7 what his opinion is on whether or not the United States is going to stay in, because I do think that there seems to be a split within the administration on that particular issue.
Do you expect a push from any of the member nations, European countries, to get him to stay on board?
Certainly. I think that we've heard this from a number of leaders within Europe. Certainly, I think the new French president in particular is quite interested in keeping the U.S. involved in this. But I also think that the president recognizes that a lot of this is money that's coming out of American taxpayers to fund places, like China, that of course are the key emitters of greenhouse gases these days, and it could place an undue burden on U.S. industry and sort of American taxpayers. So I think he's going to look very carefully at this, but I do expect, of course, many European nations that are invested in this agreement to try to keep the United States on board. So it remains to be seen what the president will do.
Dan Kochis, foreign policy analyst from the Heritage Foundation. Thanks for the time, Dan.
Thank you very much.